Okay, so today we're diving into the world of communication diagrams in software engineering. And you brought your lecture notes, which is great, because I'm hoping we can use this deep dive to really break down not just what these diagrams are, but why they're so important and how they can visually represent all the complex interactions happening within a system.
Sounds good.
Cool. So let's get right into it.
Right.
So, whenever I think about communication diagrams, the first thing that pops into my mind is this emphasis on connections. Like
Right.
it's less about the flow of time and more about how all the different pieces of your software are actually talking to each other.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that's something that, maybe a sequence diagram wouldn't really capture as effectively.
Exactly. Yeah. Communication diagrams really highlight the organization of objects that are participating in an interaction.
Right.
So we're talking about, showing those objects, the links between them, and the messages that are actually being passed.
Yeah, it's like a blueprint for how these different components are actually communicating, right?
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
So I know a lot of people listening right now who are familiar with UML have probably come across sequence diagrams.
Right.
And in fact, you even provided a visual in your notes that compares the two,
Uh-huh.
which is really helpful. And, both of these types of diagrams, they illustrate interactions, but they really have this like different focus,
Yeah, their focus is different.
right? So sequence diagrams, if I'm remembering this right, are all about timing,
Right.
who's talking when, what's the exact sequence.
Uh-huh.
But then communication diagrams, they emphasize the structure,
Yeah.
like who can even talk to who.
Right. Who's allowed to talk to who?
So let's say I'm trying to understand these really complex dependencies in a system.
Okay.
Would you say that a communication diagram is the way to go?
I would, yeah.
Okay, cool.
And it's interesting because, sequence diagrams use that kind of vertical timeline, right?
Yeah.
But communication diagrams actually use this spatial arrangement, like where you place things,
Mhm.
and then they number the messages
Right.
to show you the order in which things happen.
So it's not quite as linear.
Right.
Interesting.
But let's break down, the actual building blocks of these diagrams.
Yeah, let's do that.
So first you've got objects, and these are really just the named entities that are participating in the interaction.
Okay.
So, you might see something like colon customer
Right.
or colon shopping cart,
Yeah.
and you can put those anywhere on the diagram. There's not really a strict layout.
Okay, and then what about the lines that connect all these objects?
Right. So those are links.
Links. Okay.
And the links show that those objects, whatever they're connected to,
Mm-hmm.
they can exchange messages with each other.
So that means they can talk to each other.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it's interesting, a single link can actually have multiple messages going across it.
Oh, okay. So it's not just one message per link?
No, not at all.
Interesting. Okay. And then finally, we have the messages themselves.
Right, the actual communication.
Exactly. And these are represented by arrows.
Okay.
And they go along those links that we just talked about.
Right.
And each arrow has a label that describes what that communication actually is.
Gotcha.
And really importantly, they have sequence numbers like 1, 2.1,
Yeah.
things like that
To show the order.
to show the order.
Okay.
And there's a specific syntax for these messages.
Okay.
It's the sequence number, colon, and then what we call the message signature.
Oh, interesting.
So, a really simple example would be like 1 colon, add item, and then in parentheses, product.
Okay, so it's like a function call almost.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And then the type of message is shown by using different arrows, like an open arrow versus a filled arrow.
Okay, so it keeps it visually pretty simple.
Yeah, a lot simpler than some of the other diagrams.
Gotcha. So speaking of the sequence numbers, I think it's really key to understand how they work.
Because if I'm looking at a diagram and I see 1.1 and the 1.2,
Uh-huh.
I know those happen sequentially,
Right.
one after the other, within the scope of that original message.
Okay,
One.
exactly.
But then if I see something like 1.1.1,
Okay.
that's like a nested call, right?
It is. Yeah.
It was initiated by 1.1.
Right.
So it's like we're going deeper into the interaction.
Exactly. It's kind of like an outline.
Yeah, like an outline. Okay.
And then to add even more complexity, we can actually have conditions on these messages.
Oh, okay. So it's not always just a straightforward sequence.
Right.
So how do we represent those conditions?
So we use something called guard expressions, and they go in square brackets.
Yeah.
So for example, you might see something like 2, open square bracket, inventory greater than 0, close square bracket, colon, confirm order.
Okay, so that message confirm order
Right.
only gets sent if we actually have enough inventory.
Exactly.
I see. And what about situations where we need to do something multiple times?
Okay, so like retrying a connection or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's where we use iteration and looping.
Okay.
And you can spot this right away because an asterisk is used to indicate repetition. So
Okay.
you might see something like 3, asterisk, open square bracket, attempts less than max retries, close square bracket, colon, attempt connection.
Gotcha. So it's like a loop,
Right?
keep trying to connect until we hit that max number of retries.
Exactly.
Okay, and you can even get more specific with those loops, right?
You can actually specify a counter if you need to.
Oh, interesting.
So, you might see something like asterisk, open square bracket, I colon equals 1.3, close square bracket.
So it's like a for loop in programming.
It is, yeah, it's very similar.
Okay, I get it.
And then what about things that are happening at the same time,
Oh, yeah, concurrency.
Yeah, parallel activities.
So how do communication diagrams handle that?
So for that, we use letters,
Okay.
and they go right before the sequence numbers.
Okay.
So you might see something like a .1 colon calculate total, and then on a separate line, B.1 colon apply discount.
So those two actions are happening simultaneously.
Exactly.
Gotcha. And what if those parallel actions are happening inside of a loop?
Right. So for that, you'll see asterisk, pipe, asterisk.
Okay, so those symbols indicate parallel execution within a loop.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, now I also noticed that sometimes these diagrams are enclosed in a rectangle. What's that all about?
Yeah, so that's called a frame.
A frame.
And it's basically used to group a whole diagram together
Okay.
and give it a name, a context.
So you might see something like interaction checkout.
Right, exactly.
And I think I've seen SEDNIs used as well.
Yeah, you might see SD used. It's kind of a shorthand,
Uh-huh.
but it's probably best to stick with interaction,
Okay.
just to avoid any confusion with sequence diagrams.
Right, because DEAD could also stand for sequence diagram.
Exactly.
Okay, good point. So now that we've gone through all the basic elements of a communication diagram,
Right.
do you have any general tips for making these diagrams as effective as possible?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest one is to really keep it focused, you know?
Yeah.
You don't need to show every single interaction that could possibly happen.
Right, just the important ones.
Yeah, just the ones that are relevant to what you're trying to communicate.
Makes sense.
And then try to avoid crossing lines too much.
Okay.
That can just make things really hard to follow visually.
Yeah, you want to keep it clean.
Exactly. And then only include return values if they're absolutely crucial
Okay.
for understanding something else that's happening in the system.
So don't clutter it up with unnecessary information.
Exactly.
Okay, so it seems like, weighing the strengths and weaknesses here,
Uh-huh.
communication diagrams are really great for visualizing complex branching, iteration, and concurrency
Right.
because of that spatial nature that we talked about.
Yeah, they give you a really good overview.
But at the same time, if you're trying to follow the exact sequence of messages,
Okay.
it might require a bit more tracing
Mm-hmm.
than if you were looking at a sequence diagram.
Right, because that's more linear.
Exactly, yeah.
So each one has its own advantages.
But ultimately, both types of diagrams are conveying the same information, right?
Yeah.
Just that one emphasizes the structure, the communication diagram,
Mm-hmm.
and the other, the sequence diagram, emphasizes the timing.
Exactly.
So it's almost like having two different lenses to view the same interaction.
You can think of it that way, yeah.
And the key takeaway here, I think, is that communication diagrams are giving you this really powerful structural view
Right.
of how objects are collaborating with each other through messaging.
Mm-hmm.
And if you understand the notation, you can quickly grasp the architecture of those interactions.
Exactly.
And that's really valuable, especially when you're dealing with complex systems.
Definitely.
So just thinking about this emphasis on connections, and it makes me wonder, are there any specific scenarios where this structural perspective is particularly useful for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you're dealing with a distributed system where you have, all these different components that need to talk to each other,
Right.
like microservices, for example,
Yeah.
communication diagrams can really help you understand how everything is connected.
And how a change in one place might affect something else somewhere else.
Exactly. And that's something to keep in mind as you continue to explore all these different software engineering concepts.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up for today.
Sounds good.
So thank you so much for sharing your expertise on communication diagrams.
You're welcome.
And for everyone listening, we hope you found this deep dive insightful.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed it.
And we'll see you next time.
See you then.
All right, take care.
Bye.